And I hear the Crowley two-step wafting up the steps from this underground pit, this basement. I thought, oh my God, that's what it is. That's what's missing. That's what I'm so homesick about. I couldn't have articulated it before, but now when I heard it, I said, that's it. So I went down there and I heard a beautiful evening of music with Roger. And after the show, I went to introduce myself, and we started talking, and he's the one who said, well, you know, if you're from Louisiana, you must know all the people I learned from. Dewey Balfa, and I said, I don't know any of those people. I've been studying French for 8 years in Louisiana, and I didn't know any of the people who he considered heroes. So he said, look, if you want to know something about this, when you get home, go to Dewey Balfa's house, and he'll hook you up. Sure enough, I did. Borrowed my dad's truck, drove south of Basile, knocked on Dewey Balfa's door, no cold. I didn't even know I was coming. And I said, are you Dewey Balfa? He said, yes. I said, well, my name is Barry Olsen. I was just in France, and I saw this guy, 100 miles an hour. He said, hold, son, calm down. Come on in. And the rest, as they say, is history, because that's when I became interested in taking a look at our French heritage and culture. So I really kind of owe it all to Roger for playing the Crowley two-step at that one moment. Roger was a musician, a very popular musician in France, had a couple of hits, and was traveling around. And he's originally, he says, an army brat who grew up in lots of places in the world and fell in love with Cajun music from meeting it on the festival circuit or whatever, and looked into it, came down here, in fact, in what was it, 71, 72, 70, and met some of those people and learned from them and recorded them, and he just told me yesterday that he brought this collection and is going to donate it to the center. I'm sorry about that, Chris, more overwhelming stuff to me. And went on to study music, musicology, and had a career at the University, as you see, University of Miami, and is retired now, I think, right? And has continued to be interested in, among other things, the music of French Louisiana. And he's done some amazing research on another large repertoire singer, Alma Bartholomew, who was also recorded by Harry Oster, among others. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about her and yet another treasure of lyrical legacy, Roger.
Well, I was going to tell you the story that Barry just told us. Now, I have to make this up as I go along, but the main point is that if Barry had never met me, I'm sure that he would have found a way to get to Dewey Balfa. And here's somebody else playing Crowley two-step, and I'm sure we're all glad that he did find that. And I'm honored to be here today. I need to tell you a little bit about myself and my point of view and my experience with Cajun music. I also need to thank Josh and Jennifer, before I forget, for making this experience. For me, coming back to Louisiana was a real trip. I've been away for a long time from Louisiana. So it's a kind of a homecoming to me. I spent a lot of my musical life involved with Cajun music. I'm not Cajun, I'm not French. I grew up as an American speaking English. I'm an Army brat who went to 12 different schools in 12 years. I moved to France when I was 19 years old and lived there as an expat for 32 years. I'm now retired, not from the University of Miami, but from teaching music to children from 3 years old to 12, 13. And Cajun music informed me a lot about teaching in class, because I tended to think of the school community as a folk community, And what worked as an oral tradition in Louisiana also worked in schools. And it made my classes very enjoyable. And I'm now retired, which is even more enjoyable. And I live in Miami, where English is also sometimes a foreign language. I go back to France for a few months every year to play music and see friends and family. When I was living in France 50 years ago, I fell in love with Cajun music when I heard Nathan Abshire and his Pine Grove Boys playing the Pine Grove Blues. And in LUS Fiber. And I heard it on an archive of LP records at the American Cultural Center in Paris, which unfortunately the American Cultural Center doesn't exist anymore, but that love that it inspired in me is still here today. So, my experience in ethnomusicology goes back to the 1970s. In addition to being a performer, I was working in France. That's me on the stage there. You can see I don't have much hair right now. And that was in, I think, 1970. In France, I was working for the ethnomusicologist Claudie Marcel Dubois at the MATP, which was the National Museum of Folk Arts and Traditions. The people in the folk revival in France, a lot of them were in and out of ethnomusicology. Ethnomusicology in France was a pretty tight ship. There were about 2 jobs in the whole country, and there was a lot of independent work that really took up the slack, and a lot of those people were performing musicians as well as amateur ethnomusicologists. Cajun music wasn't so popular in 1970 as it is now. Musicians like Michael and Zachary Richard were just getting started. When I came to Louisiana, I was fortunate to meet a lot of musicians that weren't popular yet, at least to the degree we think of it today. This name sounds a little bit like a who's who. Clifton and Cleveland Chenier, Nathan Abshire, the Balfour brothers, Walter Luton, Ison Fontenot, Austin Petre, Bébé Carrière, Canray Fontenot, Emeline and Gabrielle Broussard, nobody knows them, Bathilde Balfour, who was Louis Balfour's aunt, and Alma Bartholomew. And I met all of those people and recorded them. The title of the symposium today is The Lyrical Rebellion of French Folk Song in Louisiana. So I'm going to try to be as rebellious as I can, and I want to encourage you to do the same thing. I assume the rebellion is musical and linguistic, not military, that it's fought with fiddle, songs, words, music, not with guns and bombs, and I want to show you how Alma Bartholomew's story songs have contributed to the lyrical heritage of French Louisiana. The title earlier, I need to point out, of Travailler c'est trop dur, and work is too hard, love is a cheat. I also need to comment on that work is not too hard if you love what you're doing, and love is a cheat. There might be room to invent a new French language lyricism in Louisiana, so we didn't have a dark view of love. I'm going to have to talk about words and music separately. There are several lyrical rebellions that come to mind. The first one is musical, recognizing traditional Louisiana music is not just another American music. It has its roots in the early music of France, music of the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, also in the traditional music of the French countryside. This needs to be recognized by people that listen critically to music of Louisiana, French folk song. Otherwise, the music just sounds weird. And back in 1970, it sounded even weirder than it did today because it wasn't, there weren't so many people playing it. Another rebellion is an obvious one. It's long-standing against a monolingual United States. It's a rebellion to help preserve the French language. Josh Cafferty pointed that out, saying it's rebellious just speaking French in the United States every day. Still another rebellion against the tyranny of standard French as a spoken language. One more, this one is still in its infancy, for bringing back quiet, venues like Veillée, where quieter story songs and language can be appreciated. Harder rebellion is the one against the current degree of French illiteracy in Louisiana. Literacy has many benefits, and it needs to be promoted energetically by everybody that is concerned with the future of Louisiana French. And finally, there's a rebellion for Louisiana Francophone culture that embraces the language and culture of all 18 French-speaking populations in the state. The number 18 comes from Carl Brasseau's book, and he names each one of them. Louisiana today has the means to offer a renewal of the French language, but also tolerance of diversity that's unparalleled in the rest of the French-speaking world. So, the lyrical rebellion of Louisiana French folk song, the word lyrical. Lyrical can refer to lyrics, or the words of a song, but it can also refer to the poetics of a song, the eloquent expression of feeling. Noise can give feeling to notes can get noise, but notes can give feeling to a song, but words give meaning, and both of them can be lyrical in their own way. What has poetic meaning to one generation may not to another. And one generation finds poetic meaning in the music they love, the next generation may not. Lyricism can be the poetry of hope or the poetry of despair. And if lyrical refers to the words in the song, we can say those words need silence to be understood. Lyrics and lyricism can be drowned out by noise. The old-fashioned veillée were an occasion for the lyrics of story songs to be appreciated. And a veillée was usually not quite as noisy as a Cajun music hall. Let's see if I thought I had that thing from Nathan here, but I don't. Anyway, if anybody was ever in an old-fashioned Cajun dance hall, the noise level was considerable. And somebody once said, you know, when you're dancing with a girl, when we were young, we danced with a girl who was listening to the words. You know, that would, once upon a time, ballad singers and storytellers were numerous in French Louisiana. The work of Barry and Josh Caffery show this to be true. Men like Marion Marcotte, César Vincent, Lazare Boudreau, Hyson Fontenot, the Deshotel brothers, they were all storytellers at the same time that they were singers and musicians. Women like Lula Landry, Inez Catalan, Agnès Bourque, Otile Balfour, Alma Barthelemy. If we listen to all those field recordings of everyone from Alan Lomax, Elizabeth Brandon, Harry Oster, William Owens, Barry Ancelet, we realize how widespread this tradition of story songs used to be, and how many good songs and good singers must have been lost. So let me introduce to you who I want to talk to you about today. Alma Treadaway Barthelemy. Born 1900, died in 1980. She was a songstress and ballad singer from Plaquemine Parish, south of New Orleans. Her language has been described as a prime example of colonial French. Although we'll never know just what Louisiana French sounded like 200 years ago, it's clear that Alma was not Cajun, and she didn't speak like one. Her songs, her accent, her vocabulary all make it easy to imagine that her language is a descendant of the French spoken in colonial New Orleans at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. When I first recorded her in 1970, her French was very easy to understand for a Parisian transplant like myself. This was not always the case when I came to the southwestern Louisiana and listened to some of the Cajun musicians I recorded. This was all more astonishing that Alma would be speaking colonial French, given the fact that she was born in Grand Bayou Indian Village, a small coastal community of Atakapa, Ishak, and Chouasha Native Americans. Her songs all show what Pete Seeger used to call the folk process. These songs traveled. They traveled both to Alma and they traveled away from Alma, and how they could change on their trip. They brought their lyrical heritage along with them, and they took part of Alma with them as they traveled to other times and other places. Alma was an important recipient of that lyrical heritage, and she was a source that transmitted it in a process that's still happening today. So in all of the sequences of songs I'm going to play for you in a second, I want you to keep that in mind, how it's a continuing process, that it's not this song and it's replicated again and again. It's always changing, and it probably always has been, and it probably always will be. And anybody who has ever dabbled in making up songs and performing them knows that to be true. You can't sing a song the same way 2 times, and even less if you share it with other people. Alma had a repertoire to date of 114 Louisiana French language songs that were recorded. The largest of its kind of any singer of French Louisiana French that I know. Of these, 55 are traditional French and go back to the 16th and 18th century, to the 18th century or before. And surprisingly, and this is really an unusual point, 31 of them are literary romance. They're romantic ballads, story songs that were printed in sheet music from the 18th and 19th century. Only 9 of her 114 songs are Cajun songs or American songs. Alma lived her adult life on the Mississippi River in City Price. Unusual name. They said that it was because there was a store there that sold vegetables, and the prices were the city price. But the name was changed eventually to Diamond, which is a whole other story. In a moment, I'll play to you some of her songs. This is Alma here. Let's see if I can get to this. The first one is a very well-known one, À la Clairefontaine. It's a song of nostalgia, no bitterness for a lost love, and it's almost the national anthem of French Canada. It first appeared as a printed version in France in 1704, with a book of songs by Ballard called Brunette ou Petits Airs Tendres avec les doubles et la basse continue. That means somebody could accompany them on harpsichord. They would improvise. They'd have like a lead sheet with chords, and mêlée de chansons à danser. But the song was probably going around way before 1704. This is the first printed version that we have. Here is a Canadian romanticized version of the song. Does it sound okay? Has everybody already heard this song before? And here's Alma's version. She makes it sound almost Caribbean. So that's one example of a song that came from somewhere, possibly printed, possibly not printed, maybe on a boat that was coming up the Mississippi to New Orleans. They used to stop the boats and throw their surplus fruit and vegetables off to the kids that were on the shore. Maybe somebody sang it. It's hard to tell, because a lot of times with the oral tradition, the sources are hard to tell. This song, however, is not hard to tell where it came from. Louisiana musicians have a long history of adapting English language songs into French and creating their own version. Here's a song in English by Frankie Half Pint Jackson. He and his musicians, some of them were sidemen for Duke Ellington, and this was recorded around 1937, and it's called "You Can't Put That Monkey on My Back." The song was translated and adapted into Cajun French by the Alley Boys of Abbeville in 1939. Is that too loud? And Alma sings the song, rearranged, rewritten in her own version, keeping some of the lyrics. Let's see, here it is.
Tu peux pas mettre ce macaque sur mon dos. Tu peux pas mettre ce macaque sur mon dos. Tu m'as donné tout mon vieux lait, mes vieux souliers. J'ai ramassé ça et j'ai parti comme un robot. Tu peux pas mettre ce macaque sur mon dos. Tu peux pas mettre ce macaque sur mon dos. Tu m'as dit que tu t'en allais voir ta maman l'autre bord du fleuve. Et après ce que je vois, j'étais pas seule. Et tu m'as bluffé, mais tu m'as fait le macaque sur mon dos.
No, I could play Pawn, but there's a lot of other ones I want to play. This next one has got an interesting trip. The next song tells of parents who oppose their daughter's love union. This is a big theme in I guess, in a lot of Louisiana music, the conflict between parents and children when it comes to love. The young couple prevails in this song, and the song finishes up happily with them in bed together. It was recorded by Claude and Marcel Dubois and Maggie Andrade in the Loire-Atlantique region of France, that's near Angers, in 1949. And it's remarkable how close Alma's version in Diamond, Louisiana, in 1970, was to that of Claude Roussel, someone whom Alma had never heard of, never met, never heard. And so here is first Claude Roussel singing this Par derrière chez mon père, lundi, mardi, jour de mai. And here's Alma. here is someone whose name is Helen Boudreau, who I was delighted to learn about and hear her music, and I had a great correspondence with her. She learned all these songs. Many of the songs that she recorded were from Alma, but she didn't learn them from Alma directly. She didn't learn them from her parents or her friends or her family. She learned them from the archives of recorded music at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette, which is an important change. Here's Helen Boudreau. So, another trip here. This one goes back to a source that is clear. You could have a piece of paper right in front of you, the signature and everything. This next song, it's a love song from a French writer whose name was Florian. In 1787, he wrote a hit pastoral novel that was so popular that people were making dishes, vases, jugs, souvenirs of the same story of Estelle. Florian's music was put to his poetry and story was put to music by Cherubini, who was a famous composer who was a pupil and friend of Beethoven. And Florian is still known today for having written aphorisms like "He who laughs last, laughs best." Here are two versions of Estelle. The first one is sung by a friend of mine, Laura Trillier, with the music by Cherubini and the lyrics by Florian. And the next one is sung by Alma. And notice not only how the text is, the lyrics are almost identical. In other words, Alma is singing the same words that Florian wrote 200 years earlier, with a few changes, but not that many. And Alma didn't know how to read or write. Her mother didn't know how to read or write. How did she get hold of these words and learn them? Her grandmother did. Her grandmother did. And sheet music from New Orleans and the surrounding area, Carl Brasseau told me that people, even if they didn't read or write, they would go to the opera once a year as a family outing, and they would bring back sheet music as a souvenir a lot of times. That's one possible explanation for the 30-some songs that Alma sang that have printed sources. Here's Laura Trillier singing Estelle. Can you hear it okay?
It's no, just hearing through the computer.
And here is Alma. Here's Alma singing the same song. Stop her.
Ton adresse cruelle
not rocket science to tell how different Laura's vocal training is from Alma's vocal training. And that doesn't mean that Alma is a poor singer of opera. It means that she's on a different wavelength. Her ornaments, her vocal timbre, and there's a lot of work now that has started to be done about analyzing vocal tone color and what that means. It's an important part of not just of style, but of identity, cultural identity. This next song has beautiful melody and haunting lyrics, and it's a clear demonstration of the power of the story song. Alma is at the beginning of this section that we're going to hear. Listen first to her singing the story of La Belle et les trois capitaines, or La Belle et le Capitaine, the young woman who feigns death in order to protect her honor. Here's Alma first. Helen Boudreau, who's going to sing the song with her distinctive tone color, ornamentation. And here is the Magnolia Sisters. This is an old recording. Barry just played one for me today, which is even more striking than this one, singing the same song. With Anne Savoy. Goes back to France, to its country of origin. It's pretty far out in some ways, this next one. The contemporary French singer Marion Rampal and her partner Pierre Blanchard, they take it on a pretty adventurous trip. They start out in this club by playing Alma's voice with a field recording. And then Marion Rampal joins with her own voice at some point. And then she sings it along with Alma. And then she takes it way out, dancing and singing. Let's see if I can find it here. And she goes into a bunch of bird sounds that are interesting. You'll see why in a second here. And at the end, she brings Alma back, and Alma used to tell everybody who recorded her that all of her songs had been passed down from her grandmother and her aunt, who learned them all by listening to the birds. And she never, I tried that once at the University of Miami, and I got slaughtered. They said, which kind of bird? But here is Alma talking about the birds at the end. If you can hear, it's not.
Okay, finally, the Ballet de Capitaine is also used as the theme for an orchestral composition that I have to be careful because there's somebody in here that doesn't like this one here. I'm having been a school teacher. This piece has been performed by high school and university concert bands all over the country. There must be 20 or 30 different groups that are doing this. And this is all from La Belle et la Capitaine, most likely from Thomas' recording of it. So the next song I want to play is I always found this one a really striking example. It's Pyramus and Thisbe. Pyramus and Thisbe goes back to ancient Greece and the poet Ovid. The theme was taken up by Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet. It's basically the same story. And then by Leonard Bernstein in West Side Story. Alma tells her Louisiana version of Pyramus and Thisbe. And then sings a broadside ballad that was published by many different broadside publishers, including the famous Les Images d'Épinal. Pyramus and Thisbe, they're a handsome couple. Their love ends tragically. They're fleeing their parents, who have locked them up in a kind of a jail cell, kind of a cachot in French, to keep them, lock them in their room, basically, I guess. And Thisbe has a little pocket knife called, in Louisiana French, a ganif, and she digs a little hole to get to where Pyramus is, and the two of them run away to live happily ever after, except they run into a lion on the way. And the lion is hungry and thirsty, and there's no water anywhere around, and so the lion starts to attack Thisbe, and she runs away and hides herself in a cave, but her veil falls, and the lion picks up the veil and bloodies it, and then goes on to find better food. And Pyramus comes along, finds the veil, and thinks that Thisbe is dead. And so he takes his sword and kills himself. Or not quite, because he's dying, and Thisbe comes out from the cave and sees Pyramus, who's there, and she takes his sword and kills herself. And that's the end of the story, except there's a warning to parents: don't mess around with your kids' love affairs. Here is Alma. I won't play the whole thing, and I won't play the 42 verses that Alma sings. The story, but her telling the story is pretty remarkable.
C'était une chanson
You'll have to trust me that her story goes on for 5 minutes, and for those of you who speak French, it's really worth a listen. Here is Alma singing the story, and you can see all the verses up and down on the side of the Alma was 70 years old when she was singing this from 1970. Right? Let's see if this was any better. Let's go back. Here is she telling a story. The story is lost for today. Once more, I'm sorry, but you just have to trust me. It is worth listening to. The next song is described by Harry Oster as being one of the most ancient ones in French Louisiana. It has different titles, but the storyline is generally the same. It's once more about parents and kids. This time it's an outraged father who wants to kill his daughter for religious disloyalty. But then he changes his mind out of Christian mercy. The song goes back easily to the French wars of religion and probably way before. Here's a song, first song is a ballad by Alma.
C'est la Sainte Marguerite, c'est la Sainte Marguerite, la fille du roi. Et ah, et ah, et la fille du roi. Et ah, et ah. C'est ça que vous voulez?
Then revitalized by Helen Boudreau.
C'est la fille de Papalon, baraboum boum 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 boum. C'est la fille de Papalon et la fille du roi. Hey ha, allez la fille du roi. Hey ha.
And then finally completely Cajunized by François Pétain. Idea that comes to mind, it's easier to take a song, even with 42 verses, and turn it into a piece of dance music than it is to go it the other way around. The words and the music are there. There's some material that you can work with and you can adapt it. It's hard to take a dance piece. It's harder to take a dance piece and put words to it with the same facility. It just occurs to me that might be something worth thinking about. Anyway, if you recall, at the beginning of when I was talking today, I was talking about different rebellions, and those different rebellions that are happening in French Louisiana music today are all contributing to a new lyricism in French Louisiana music that's being created as we speak now. They're all parting in their different ways, like different bodies of water that are moving towards the same goal. The first rebellion, remember, is a musical rebellion, how Louisiana music is not just by accident, it's not just a weird sounding music, it has roots too. And some of those roots go back a long way. They go back to early music of France and to the traditional music of the French countryside. Second rebellion is obvious. It's against a monolingual United States. And remember that French is more than just a language. It embodies traditional French values of love, of respect for nature, for the joys of life. If a language disappears, it's a sign of a disappearing culture. And it's very difficult for Cajun culture to be healthy if French disappears. So they're really tied together. I mean, we could say that Cajun culture is popular today because of the food, because of the dance music, because of the lifestyle. But if the French language disappears, a lot of those things are going to be put on the endangered species list. Third rebellion is against the tyranny of standard French as a spoken language. Not necessarily as a written language, but as a spoken language, for sure. Another rebellion in its infancy is bringing back venues where quieter story songs can be appreciated. You can't listen to the words if you can't hear them. And still another one is to promote more French language literacy in the state. Literacy has many benefits and should be promoted energetically. It's obviously not without problems. How to get Louisiana French and respect Louisiana French, and how to get that into a written form that other French speakers can understand is obviously a problem, but it needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed. The literacy is an important goal. And finally, there's a rebellion for Louisiana Francophone culture that embraces all the 18 French-speaking populations in the state. Alma was a Chawasha, Takapa Ishak, Native American, but her contribution to Louisiana French music is evident. Louisiana today has the opportunity to renew the French language and present a tolerance of diversity. The theme of this symposium, as part of the General Festival, was the lyrical heritage of French Louisiana. Alma is part of that heritage. Where did her own French heritage go? In the last 2 years, I've contacted members of Alma's family, and was saddened to discover that Alma's heritage may no longer be in Grand Bayou. And it is no longer in Alma's own family, at least the language part. Her French heritage has to be found in other places. I called up Alma's granddaughter in New Orleans, and I said I was interested in Alma Barthélemy, and she said, "You mean Alma Bartholomew?" Her other members of her family live in Hawaii, and they're living their lives. They're aware of their grandmother, but there's no, and in the tribal members that I interviewed in Grand Bayou, there's been a language switch, there's been a religion switch to evangelical Protestantism. The village itself was so destroyed by hurricanes that at one point there was only one 70-year-old woman, Ruby Ankar, that was living there. Today there's about 40 or 50 people that have come back, but they have other problems besides reviving Alma's repertoire. So this heritage is still alive, but it's not found in the place that you might expect it to be. It can be found in Cajun Louisiana, even though Alma wasn't Cajun. It can be found in the songs of Beau Soleil, Bonsoir Catan, the Magnolia Sisters, Helen Monroe, and all of the people that are on the people that you're going to listen to tonight with the César Vincent tribute. It can be found in the repertoire of singers in Acadia, in France, Quebec, and hopefully one day it will serve as supplementary material, along with many other traditional singers. It will serve as supplementary material in French immersion classes everywhere that French is taught. Alma is not alone as a carrier of the French lyrical tradition in her home music and story songs, but she is unique by the size and variety of her repertoire. She's unique as well by the clear connection of many of her songs to 18th and 19th century printed French sheet music. There are not a lot of singers in the oral tradition where this has been really examined thoroughly. Mostly because there's a kind of a prejudice that oral tradition has to be pure oral tradition. But we're living in an age now where if Helen Boudreau learns the songs from the archives of the University of Louisiana in Lafayette, is that the pure oral tradition? It's an oral tradition, but she learned it through something that was already recorded. When I talk to ethnomusicologists in France and I say, well, you should listen to some of the old phonograph records from Louisiana, they say, oh, well, that's not the pure tradition, that it wasn't recorded in somebody's house, or and we need to overcome this kind of mindset, because oral tradition is bigger than that.
So why aren't they more accepting that tradition is how you can get it? I mean,
Well, I agree with you, yeah. I agree with you, but I think that early ethnomusicologists, early people that made field recordings, they wanted to distinguish between what was classical trained musicians who worked from a printed piece of music, and those people that learned it from their parents or their relatives. And so they did not want the printed version to come and contaminate the other one. And I think we're still living a little bit with that. And finally, Alma is unique by her Native American identity. That we talk about Cajun and Creole music as being part of the French tradition in Louisiana. We also need to talk about Native American contributions in Louisiana, which is significant.
now, can you go back a little bit off your subject? Do these three tribes merge together, or?
Yeah, I talked about Ishak and the Chawasha have come together in this town called Grand Bayou, and it's even more complicated than that because the Chawasha were known for traveling around, and the Atakapa Ishak are in 4 or 5 different places in Texas and Louisiana, and in Grand Bayou, when I interviewed them, asked which tribe that they were from. Some of them were Shoshone, they said. Some of them said they were Chitimacha. Some of them were. So there's a pan-Indian kind of identity in Grand Bayou Indian Village today. But this is the dominant tribal affiliation, I guess that you could say. I hope that Alma has been a pleasure to listen to. I find that I'm constantly learning things. Just yesterday, I found the text of a 17th and 18th century poet from the Basque country, and he wrote the words to a poem that was put to music and sung by an opera singer for King Louis XV of France, and Alma sings a version of this song. And it's one of the most beautiful songs that she sings. I hope that I've added a little bit to her reputation as an important figure in French Louisiana story songs. Her songs that are a mixture of colonial and Indian French hold riches for all French speakers today. Remember that to think of her not just as a recipient, but also as a transmitter of Louisiana's lyrical heritage. Thank you. If there are any questions or comments, I'd be glad to reply. Yes, John.
Roger, how did you first come to meet Alma? How did you first find her?
Harry Auster's recordings. I heard when I was in Paris in 1960.
And you just kind of tracked her down from when you
Yeah, I was fascinated by hearing that I was an American in France, and here were people who were French in America.
Yeah.
And so I was attracted, and I went down to this and found her.
poked around until you found her?
Yeah, there was a boy in the village. I said, you know, Alma Barthelemy. Yes.
Where exactly is Grand Bayou?
Grand Bayou is about 60 miles south of New Orleans, going down towards Sulphur. It's on that, you know, there's a lot of oil refineries.
I was told that the attacker ball was from southwest Louisiana.
They are.
Jean Lafitte would use them. He had a warehouse run by the LeBrews near Lake Charles, what is now Lake Charles. And the attacker ball would help him meander through the swamps and bayous. And they'd also serve as pirates on their ships sometimes. And he bought a bunch of them over there and left them. That's how those people supposedly got there. Fascinating story. I wish the real trip was true.
That's incredible.
I have a question, I mean, it's kind of tangential to this, but you just talked about that whole notion of oral tradition, and I'm wondering how folklorists, what the sort of new vision of that is, because obviously young people who learn songs from each other today, whether we're talking about a commercial recording or not, is kind of irrelevant, because everybody's going to say, oh, I love this song, I want to learn it, and they're turning their iPhones on.
They don't worry about
Does that disqualify you from being, that being the bouche à l'oreille tradition? I mean, what do...
Barry's a good person to answer that
I'm
question.
curious to know how that's seen among the folklore people.
Well, there's some people who perceive themselves as purists, but I think instead of being purists, I think they're sort of trapped in an old way of thinking about things. I mean, look at the number of Acadian musicians and Creole musicians who have learned from records. They never met me. I'm sure I don't think they did. So, I mean, I think it's
an old
I mean,
question.
there's some people who still think that way, but most, clever musical people
You know, when you think of it, oral tradition is sound.
Yeah.
It's sound. It's not, it's not paper. You can't hear anything when the music is written down. You have to have the sound. And how the sound is transmitted.
Should be irrelevant.
Marie Law Woodrow just did her doctoral dissertation on transmission of music and song through the web and through other things. Like, I mean, there are a lot of people within Louisiana and from outside Louisiana who take fiddle lessons with the tree. And that didn't skip a beat when he moved to Maine.
Because the internet was...
So, I mean, we live in a different time.
There's I think your name, Walter Long, who wrote a book about oral tradition, is somewhat famous. He's a Jesuit priest, and he has an expression, technologies of the word. So the idea that oral tradition itself is a technology.
Yeah.
So that's one way that I try to think about it, is that oral tradition, singing is a technology for communicating these things, but by the same token, so is an iPhone, and so is a tape recorder, or the reel-to-reels we're working on. Just different sorts of technologies for human expression.
Really important.
By the way, unlike Cesar Ressa, who I mentioned earlier, died before the wave of interest, Alma lived until
1980.
well into it. And in 1976, she was at the Smithsonian Festival.
I should have said that.
Yeah. She was at the Smithsonian Festival along with Inez Catalan, Little Landry from here, and there was a singer from New Brunswick, and one from Quebec, and a couple from France. And the one from France was from Auvergne, Louise Lichard.
Louise Michel.
Louise Lichard, and Louise Lichard, they were doing a ballad workshop that afternoon on the wall in Washington, D.C. Louise Lichard was up there in the middle singing, this amazingly complex, long verse song. And at the end, everybody was clapping, and and Alma struggled out of her seat and walked up and said, "Mais t'as pas fini la chanson." Sang 4 more verses. And Louise was standing next to her going, and then Alma realized, "Ooh, I might have offended." She said, "I'm sorry." And Louise said, "No, not at all. I learned a song from my grandfather, and he used to sing some of those words, and I didn't remember it." Suddenly, wow, yeah, 350 years and 7,000 miles.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Alma was sort of kind of frail by then too.
This was in '76.
Yeah, so to have wanted that much to finish that song to struggle.
But she hung on till 1980, and if any of you are interested, I can recommend, there's a guy named Luis Alvarez, along with a partner, who's Coulter. On YouTube, they did a whole series on Plaquemine Parish, and specifically on Judge Perez, and interviewed Alma in this about Judge Perez. Complicated racial story about schools, and because Perez said that Louisiana schools in Plaquemine Parish were integrated because there was a Protestant missionary school where some Indians went. A lot of the Indians didn't want to go to school with African Americans because the African American schools were separate from the white schools. Anyway, Alma said that Perez had done nothing good for her and her people. When I interviewed Alma's uncle last year, they thought Perez was like John F. Kennedy. He was the hero of the tribe, and it's a very complicated set of stories. But in any case, the point of all this, before I started rambling, is Coker and Alvarez, they put all of Alma's interview on YouTube. And if you type in Madame Alma, I did because I showed some interest in it, which just shows you it doesn't take much to get things to happen sometimes. There's an hour of Alma on YouTube. All you have to type in is Madame, I think Madame Alma or Madame Barthélemy. And you'll hear, I think she sings 7 or 8 songs in it. She talks, and it gives you really a wonderful picture of who she was in 1980. While I'm talking about that, I also need to tell you that I have a book of my field recordings and field recordings of some others with some very hopefully interesting songs that are, and if any of you are interested in it, it should come out. You can see an example of one chapter here, and you can put your email on here on a mailing list, and you can be contacted when the book comes out. It's coming out with Tantamount of Shreveport, with Dana Kress. Any other questions? Yes.
In your studies of the connections back to France, was there a particular region or
You know,
connected?
I always thought that there was, but more and more I'm beginning to realize how widespread it is. There are songs that have popped up in Louisiana that came from the Alps near Italy. There are songs that have popped up from the Basque Country, from Normandy, from the Poitou, the Charente. Alma had something that's unusual in Louisiana, in southwest Louisiana. She had a lot of sea songs, sailor songs. There are not too many sailor songs around Mahmoud. But
Yeah, I did find a version of Parle nous avoir from Béarn,
okay,
south of Bordeaux.
that's.
So they came from all over the place.
They came from all over the place. And the first one, I first met Alan Lomax in the 70s. He wrote the preface to this book. Everybody thought that, at least at the time, he thought that all vacation music came from Normandy. And the work that I had done indicated that there was a lot of it that came from the Poitou-Charente area, which was about halfway between France and Spain. So I told him that. I also told him he could get really good oysters if he he did, and I think to thank me, he wrote the preface.
Roger, I noticed you had some shots of voyageurs and fur trappers and whatnot. That made me think a little bit about the kind of the aquatic nature of some of the songs. You know, I mean, she's right there by the Mississippi River in Plaquemine Parish. You know, thinking of the colonial interactions between the.
They could have come down the river instead of coming up it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's another. We talk about the Acadiens and you know the print sources, but then there's that other older layer of voyageur songs. You know, people who could have come even earlier. So it makes sense that there'd be seafaring
good
songs in that area.
This, try to condense this, but one of the things that you kept showing the slide of the different groups, and you mentioned the 18 groups, and then you talked about technology, and one of the things that's true of every language at all times is that the speakers of that language in the broadest sense have a common identity, and then within that language, linguistic traditions and practices develop which give us separate identities within that larger community. That's universal. But it's not the same in every language. Every language has its own culture and history in which that happened. And one of the big events that happened, of course, you talk about all these different regions, is the New World, right? All those values of old languages got reshuffled when people moved across the oceans and were mixed in, even if you just look at that group, whatever it is, before they mixed with anyone they met once they got there. But another very big thing, which I'm, no offense to the many scholars whose works are in one way or another represented in this room, but that is incredible to me how little attention it's gotten. Every language, as I say, has its history, but in France, there were two countries loyal to the King of France during the medieval centuries. And the Acadiens left right after that period finally ended, at the very end of that period. So they really were formed there, so that's my interest in it, I suppose. But Languedoc, which is a word at least some people have heard, but the other country is Languedoc, right? So that's the Parisian thing, and we say we now, we spell it differently, that's international French. Both countries had the name language of yes. If you said yes by saying okay, by the way, if you said okay, like we say okie dokie, that's Languedoc. If you say, if you said that, you belong to Languedoc, and if you said we, you belong to Languedoc. But those were two separate social and legal and cultural societies. Languedoc was a very militaristic, centralized society where the king could write an order with the advice of ministers or without it, or a powerful duke could, and it was the law. And in the Languedoc, that was called the Pays de Droit Écrit, the country of written laws, and almost entirely, there wasn't a perfect 100% connection, but almost entirely Languedoc was the Pays de Coutume, or the land of custom, but it also is, I believe, the root of the Swiss canton. So these were private, separate, administrative, federalist systems in which people consented in their government, participated in it, and had through a sort of an early notary system, a way of controlling legal development. So profoundly different cultures. And as that system collapsed is when a handful of people from Poitou and so forth moved to the other side of the world. It was only a short distance, but a whole new world. And that is one example of a response to this process. Most of the writing, most of the literacy, most of the culture came from that southern part. The north was largely illiterate. But over time, the illiterate savages in the north, with a lot of military power who gained control, began to describe Languedoc language and culture as peasant language, as a low-class language, as a language of the unlearned, as the powerful one-third of the country began to rule the whole French world. So that whole story is somehow never, ever makes a footnote in any of these discussions. And again, I don't mean that, but I just wonder how we can look at the development of French without noticing that enormous chapter.
Well, it's complicated. Your point is an interesting one, and push it even a little bit further. They say that in the 19th century, even at the end of the 19th century, a good half of France didn't know how to read or write, and the French couldn't understand each other when they talked to each other. Because in Brittany they spoke Breton, and Alsace they spoke Alsatian. In the south of France they spoke the Languedoc. They spoke Ch'timi in the north. They spoke, and then each area also, we lived in the Poitou for a while, and if you went 10 miles down the road, the dialect all ended in an O instead of an A, and if you tried to open a restaurant 10 miles down the road, nobody would come because you were a foreigner.
The old saying, you have to change your language as often as you change your horse, right?
All right, there you go.
And there was a lot of reasons that standardized French, which doesn't belong to any particular area in France. Standardized French is just a construction so that people, it's like a lingua franca, so that people can understand each other. At least that historically, I think that's one of the things that happened. But your point is interesting. My thing is that it's constantly ongoing now. I mean, there are people in France, maybe not so much today, but a few years ago that were, the Bretons now are they still speak French, but their language of heart is Breton. That it? Okay. Thank you.
Hey guys, before everyone leaves, I just want to thank Roger again for making the trip out here. And I want to say that he is also, besides being a song scholar, a phenomenal musician. We posted some videos of him playing spoons. He is an impresario of spoons. Is probably one of the better spoon player I've ever heard. But he's also a multi-instrumentalist, a guitarist. And he's going to be at the festival Atelier stage, backed up by Kelly Jones and Blake Miller on Sunday. So you can hear some of his interpretations of, I imagine, some of these songs, as well as some other material.
Can I request a Crowley two-step?
Yes.
So thank you guys all for coming. And we talked about the muses at the beginning of this. I think the muses have been kind to us. And have a great festival.
Okay, so don't forget.
The preceding program was made possible in part with production assistance provided by AOC Community Media.